He didn't even look up when he slid the papers across the desk. 11 years of marriage, and Damien Sterling couldn't be bothered to make eye contact. Sign it, he said, straightening his cufflinks like the conversation was already over. I had legal make it generous. You won't have to worry about money. Vivian Cross looked at the settlement figure, $8 million. And then she did something Damien never expected. She uncapped her pen, signed every page without reading a single line, pushed the stack back across the mahogany, and stood up. Keep it, she said quietly. Every dollar. And then she looked at him, really looked at him, for what would be the last time. Be careful, Damien. The person you underestimate may be the one holding up your entire world. He laughed. Actually laughed. If this story speaks to you, stay until the very end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Damien Sterling decided to end his marriage, he woke up feeling lighter than he had in years. That was the thing nobody would understand later. Not his lawyers, not his board, not the journalist who would eventually pick through the wreckage of everything that followed. He hadn't been agonizing over this decision for months. He hadn't lost sleep. He hadn't sat in a therapist's office, rehearsing hard conversations or stared at old wedding photographs, wondering where things had gone wrong. He had simply woken up one Tuesday in October, looked at the ceiling of his penthouse bedroom, and thought, I'm done. It felt clean, efficient, like finally clearing out a storage room you'd been meaning to get to for years. He was 43 years old, worth approximately $4.7 billion by the most recent Forbes estimate, though his CFO privately put the number closer to 6, and he was, by every visible measure, a man at the absolute peak of his powers. Damien Sterling had built Sterl Tech from a two-person startup operating out of a borrowed office in San Jose into one of the most dominant enterprise software companies in North America. He had done it through intelligence, through relentlessness, through a specific kind of charm that made investors open their checkbooks, and employees work 70-hour weeks without quite realizing they'd agreed to it. He knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. And Vivian, quiet, contained, always slightly peripheral Vivian, had simply stopped fitting into the picture he had of himself. He called his personal attorney from the car on the way to the office. Daniel Howe had handled Damien's legal affairs for 9 years and understood intuitively when to skip the preamble. Divorce proceedings, Damien said. I want papers ready by Thursday. A pause. Vivian, is there another wife I'm not aware of? No, of course not. Another pause, shorter. Have you discussed this with her? I'm discussing it with you. Daniel cleared his throat. We should talk about asset division. There's no prenuptial agreement, which means I know what it means. Draw up a settlement. Make it generous. $8 million, liquid, plus she keeps whatever's in the joint accounts. He watched the Bay Bridge slide past his window. I want her comfortable. I just want her gone. He didn't say it cruelly. That was the strangest part. He said it the same way he might have said, I want that account closed, or I want that vendor off our roster. It was the tone of a man managing inventory. Daniel had the papers ready by Wednesday afternoon. Damien reviewed them briefly in his office. 41st floor, floor-to-ceiling glass. The whole sprawling geometry of San Francisco laid out below him like something he personally owned, and signed where indicated with the same blunt efficiency he brought to acquisition agreements and quarterly reports. Then he had his assistant call Vivian and ask her to come in at 4 o'clock. Not to the house, to the office. He had made that choice deliberately, though he would have struggled to explain why. Something about doing it at the house felt messier. The office was his territory. Things moved quickly here. People didn't make scenes. Vivian arrived at 4:03. She was wearing a gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers, her dark hair pulled back simply. No jewelry except her watch. She looked, as she always looked, like a woman who had stopped trying to be noticed, or perhaps had never tried in the first place. She was 41 years old and still genuinely beautiful, though she moved through the world as if that were a fact largely irrelevant to her purposes. She sat down across from his desk and looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had always unsettled him slightly, though he'd never been able to say precisely why. You asked me to come in, she said. Not a question. Damien slid the envelope across the desk. I think we've run our course. She didn't reach for it immediately. She looked at it for a moment, then back at him. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. The settlement is in there. $8 million plus the joint accounts. The house in Marin can go on the market. You get half the proceeds. Daniel will walk you through anything you have questions about. I won't have questions, Vivian said. She picked up the envelope, opened it, and removed the papers with the careful movements of someone who was in no particular hurry. She scanned each page. Not quickly, actually read them. Damien watched her and found himself slightly annoyed by how calm she was. He had expected something, not a breakdown necessarily, but some flicker of distress, some evidence that this mattered. There was nothing. She turned pages. Her face was composed. After several minutes, she reached into her bag, retrieved a pen, her own pen, not the one he'd set out, and signed where indicated. Every page. No hesitation. She set the papers on his desk and stood up. "Keep the money," she said. He blinked. "Vivian, I don't want it." She picked up her bag. "I never wanted your money, Damien. I want you to understand that." She said it without heat, without accusation, as a simple statement of fact. "I never needed it." He opened his mouth to say something. He wasn't sure what, but she was already turning toward the door, and something in the line of her back made him stop. Then she paused, turned just enough to look back at him over her shoulder. "Be careful," she said. "The person you underestimate may be the one holding up your entire world." Damien Sterling, $4.7 billion, 43rd floor, masters of his domain, laughed. He actually laughed. "I built this world myself," he said. "I think it'll hold." Vivian looked at him for one moment longer. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite pity, something quieter than both. "I know you believe that," she said. And then she left. The first thing Damien did after she walked out was call his assistant and ask her to book a table at Aquarello for dinner with Marcus Webb, his head of acquisitions. Then he loosened his tie, swiveled his chair toward the window, and looked out at the city. He felt good. Not guilty, not conflicted, good. Like something that had been pressing against his chest for years had finally lifted. He was aware distantly that this probably said something unflattering about him as a human being, but he had gotten very comfortable over the years separating his self-knowledge from his self-image. He knew he was not easy. He knew he could be cold. He had simply decided, somewhere around his 38th birthday, that these were the costs of becoming the kind of man he had become, and that the math worked out in his favor. Vivian had been an excellent wife in the technical sense. She had managed their social life with quiet competence. She had never embarrassed him publicly, never made demands, never created the kind of domestic upheaval that derailed other executives he knew. She was the sort of woman other people described as steady and gracious and a perfect fit for him, which in retrospect should have told him something. People praised her as though she existed primarily in relationship to him, and she had never pushed back against that framing. But she had also been, for at least the last 3 years, functionally invisible in his life. They had maintained parallel schedules, polite dinners, careful silences. He traveled constantly. She stayed in the Marine house, or she traveled somewhere separately. He was often fuzzy on the details. She had never complained. She had never pushed. She had simply been there, quietly, in the background. And at some point there, quietly, in the background, had started to feel like an obstacle rather than a comfort. There was also Celeste Harmon. Damien didn't think of her as the reason. He had rationalized himself past that months ago, but she was certainly a component. Celeste was 34, the head of product development at a mid-size AI company he'd been in acquisition talks with, and she was the specific kind of electric that Vivian had stopped being. Conversations with Celeste felt like conversations where things were actually at stake. She pushed back. She challenged him. She made him feel like a man who still had something to prove rather than a man cataloging his achievements. He told himself the marriage had been over long before Celeste. He believed it mostly. He called Marcus from the car and spent the 40-minute ride to the restaurant talking about the Meridian acquisition, a $700 million deal that had been in negotiation for weeks and was finally nearing close. It was a clean call, focused, the kind of conversation that confirmed for Damien that his mind was exactly where it needed to be. Sharp, forward-moving. He did not think about Vivian again until the next morning. She had left a single item in the house. Not clothes, not photographs, not any of the accumulated furnishings and objects that 11 years of shared life had produced. Those were gone, efficiently, overnight, with no drama and no truck visible in the driveway, which Damien found slightly disorienting when he thought about it later. What she left was a key. On the kitchen counter, on top of a plain white note card with nothing written on it. Just a key, small, unremarkable, the kind that might open a safe deposit box or a storage unit or something else entirely. Damien picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and set it in the kitchen drawer with the takeout menus and the spare batteries. He assumed she'd forgotten it and expected it meant she might contact him about it. She didn't. He forgot about it within a week. The lawyers finalized the divorce on a Friday, 49 days after Vivian signed the papers. Damien's attorney called to confirm, and Damien said thank you and moved on to the next item on his schedule within 20 seconds. He celebrated, if you could call it that, with dinner at a private table with Celeste, where they talked about the Meridian deal and drank a very good Barolo, and she leaned across the table at some point and said, "You seem different tonight." Different how? Lighter. She considered him. Like you put something down. He smiled and let her interpret that however she wanted. What followed was, for approximately 2 weeks, exactly the kind of life Damien Sterling had decided he deserved. The Meridian acquisition closed. Sterltech's Q3 earnings beat projections by 11%. He was invited to speak at a summit in Zurich, where he gave a talk that received a standing ovation and generated the kind of press coverage that his PR team described as almost suspiciously positive. Celeste joined him in Zurich for the final 2 days, and they spent a Sunday walking along the lake in weather that felt curated for him specifically. He called his assistant on the flight home and told her to book a reservation at a restaurant that had a 6-month wait list because he felt like celebrating. "What are we celebrating?" she asked. He thought about it. "Everything," he said. He meant it. It started small. That was the thing about Collapse. It rarely announced itself with appropriate drama. It came in sideways, through the ordinary channels, disguised as inconvenience or bad luck or coincidence. And by the time you recognized it for what it had already been happening for weeks. The first sign was Hartwell Industrial. Hartwell had been Sterltech's primary hardware integration partner for 6 years, a deeply embedded relationship, the kind that had its own dedicated project team and a master services agreement that auto-renewed annually without anyone looking at it particularly closely. They were the kind of partner you stopped thinking about because they just worked. Damien's VP of operations, a precise woman named Sandra Kwan, who did not come to him with things unless they were worth coming with, knocked on his office door on a Monday morning with a look on her face he didn't quite like. "Hartwell gave notice," she said. Damien looked up from his screen. "What kind of notice?" "Contract termination, effective in 60 days. No explanation given. Their legal team cited the standard exit clause and declined further comment." She set a printed email on his desk. "This came through Friday evening. I wanted to flag it first thing." Damien read the email twice. It was, as Sandra indicated, remarkably bare, legal language, formal, the kind of communication that said everything through what it didn't say. "No, it's been a pleasure" language. No indication of an alternative vendor they'd like to recommend. Nothing that suggested this was an economic decision or a strategic pivot. Just, "We are exercising our right to terminate under Section 12. B." "Did anyone from their team reach out informally?" he asked. "No. I tried calling Marcus Chen over there. We've had a good relationship, and his assistant said he wasn't available. He hasn't called back." Damien sat with that for a moment. "Keep trying, and get procurement to start identifying backup options. This shouldn't be hard to replace." Sandra nodded, but something in her posture suggested she wasn't entirely sure about that last part. She was right to be uncertain. Over the next 8 days, 3 more vendors terminated contracts. Not small vendors. Not peripheral relationships that could be quietly absorbed. Meridian Cloud, which had been the backbone of Sterltech's storage architecture for 4 years. Prescott Data, the analytics firm that handled 2 of their largest enterprise client integrations. And Nova Logistics, the distribution partner responsible for their physical hardware deployments across the Western region. Each termination came through legal channels, citing standard contractual exit provisions, offering no explanation. Damien's team made calls, they sent emails, they arranged meetings that got canceled. They reached people who were politely unavailable and assistants who said the right things and promised callbacks that never came. It was like shouting into a very expensive, very well-maintained wall. "This is not a coincidence," Sandra said in a closed-door meeting on the Thursday of that second week, with Damien and the CFO and the head of legal arranged around the small conference table adjacent to his office. 4 major partners in 8 days, all citing the same clause, none of them giving any reason. Someone is pulling a coordinated exit. Who? The CFO, a careful analytical man named Phil Reyes, asked, "We haven't had any public incidents. No litigation, no regulatory issues. Our last audit was clean." "I don't know," Sandra said, "but I've been in this industry long enough to know what coordinated looks like. This is coordinated." Damien had been quiet for most of this conversation. He was doing the thing he did when he was working through a problem he didn't yet have enough information to solve, absorbing everything, saying little, waiting for a shape to emerge. "What's our client exposure?" he asked Phil. Phil exhaled slowly. "If we can't replace Meridian's storage architecture within 45 days, 3 of our enterprise contracts hit service-level penalties. That's approximately $40 million in exposure. Nova's departure is operationally complicated but manageable if we move fast. Prescott is..." He paused. "Prescott is more concerning. The Halloran and Dynacorp integrations depend on their pipeline. If those break down, we're talking about potential contract terminations from the client side, not just the vendor side." "Fix it," Damien said. "All of it, whatever resources you need. This is the priority." They moved fast. Damien's team was good at fast. It was one of the things he genuinely prided himself on, the operational velocity of Sterltech, the ability to pivot without falling apart. They identified alternative vendors. They drew up emergency contracts. They got on planes and flew to meetings with potential replacement partners, armed with Sterltech's financial strength and Damien's own reputation as a closer. The meetings went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not at first. Just wrong in the subtle accumulating way that made Damien's stomach tighten a little more each time. Vendors who had been enthusiastic in initial conversations went cold before signatures. Companies that had been courting Sterltech's business for years suddenly had concerns about timing or capacity constraints, or were exploring other opportunities. One potential replacement partner for Meridian, a firm Damien had dealt with personally and considered a reliable contact, agreed to a meeting and then called the evening before to cancel, with his assistant offering no rescheduling date. Damien sat in his San Francisco office at 7 in the evening on a Wednesday, 3 weeks since Vivian had walked out of this same room, and stared at the view that always made him feel like he owned the city. It didn't feel that way right now. He pulled out his phone and called his oldest friend, not a business contact, but a genuine friend from his 20s, a man named Chris Doyle, who had no stake in anything and who would tell him the truth without managing him. "Something is happening to my company," Damien said when Chris picked up, "and I don't understand what it is yet." Chris was quiet for a moment. "What kind of something?" "Coordinated, deliberate, but invisible. I can't find the source. It's like..." He stopped. Tried to find the right words. "You know when you're in a meeting and you realize halfway through that everyone in the room knows something you don't? And they decided before you walked in how it was going to go? Yeah. It feels like that. Except the meeting is my entire industry and I walked in late." Chris said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is there anyone in your life who would want this? Someone with the reach to pull this kind of thing?" Damien almost dismissed the question, but something snagged. He sat with it, and sat with it. He didn't connect it to Vivian immediately. That would come later through channels he hadn't expected, in the form of information that arrived with the specific quality of a thing that had always been true but simply hadn't been visible to him. What happened first was that his head of investor relations, a man named Robert Liang, who was normally unflappable to the point of being almost irritating about it, came to him with the news that 3 of Sterltech's largest institutional investors were making noise. Not pulling out, not yet. Making noise. Asking questions, requesting calls with the board, wanting assurances about the vendor situation that Robert was struggling to provide because the vendor situation was, at this particular moment, not fully under control. "This is a confidence issue," Robert said. "They don't think there's a crisis yet. They think there might be one. And that's almost worse because it means they're watchful. Any more bad news in the next 30 days, and we start seeing movement." Damien's stock had dropped 7% in 2 weeks. Not catastrophic, noticeable. He called an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday and spent the weekend preparing. He slept badly. He ate badly. He drank a glass of scotch most evenings that he told himself was just unwinding and knew was slightly more than that. On Sunday afternoon, he sat in the Marine house, his house now entirely, and found himself walking through the rooms without quite knowing why. The spaces where Vivian's things had been were strange. Not empty exactly, because she had taken only her things, and he had never noticed how much of the house she had actually filled until she had removed herself from it precisely and cleanly, the way she did everything. He found himself in the kitchen, opening the drawer where he'd put her key. He held it for a long time. Then he put it back and poured himself the scotch. Tut. The board meeting on Tuesday was the most uncomfortable 2 hours Damien had spent in a conference room in recent memory, which was notable because he had spent a lot of uncomfortable hours in conference rooms. The board was not hostile. His board was never hostile. He had built it carefully over the years, seating people who respected what he had built and trusted his operational instincts. But that trust had a foundation, and foundations required maintenance, and the vendor crisis had exposed something none of them had thought to look at closely. Just how much of Sterltech's operational infrastructure rested on relationships that no one in his C-suite had fully mapped or understood. These partners didn't just leave. One board member, a former tech exec named Rosamund Fisher, who had the particular directness of someone who had seen companies fail, said toward the end of the meeting. Partners like Hartwell don't exit arrangements this profitable without a reason. Someone convinced them it was worth their while to walk away from your money. She looked at him steadily. Do we know who that someone is? We're investigating, Damien said. Rosamund's expression suggested she was not satisfied with that answer, but was choosing not to say so directly. That was in its own way more unsettling than if she'd pushed. After the board cleared out, Phil Reyes stayed behind. There's something I've been sitting on, Phil said. He was a careful man, and he chose the phrase carefully, which meant the information was something he'd been uncertain about sharing. It came through an indirect channel, a contact in the financial sector who wanted to stay unnamed. Tell me. Phil sat down. Are you familiar with the Ashford Consortium? Damien knew the name the way he knew the names of things that existed in the upper atmosphere of wealth and influence, not because he had ever encountered them directly, but because they were referenced in the same reverential shorthand as other institutions of significant and somewhat opaque power. Private holding group, he said. European roots, global reach. Reclusive. They don't make public statements. That's right. They don't make public statements, they don't take meetings outside a very specific circle, and they don't involve themselves in anything that isn't worth their time. Phil paused. Every vendor that has terminated our contracts in the last 3 weeks has a financial relationship with a holding entity that traces back to the Ashford Consortium. I've had 3 different analysts verify this independently. The room was very quiet. My contact says the consortium has recently undergone a transition, Phil continued. A leadership change. The patriarch, the man who ran it for 40 years, passed away 8 months ago. His stake and operational control transferred to his sole heir. Damien was looking at the table. He had a feeling, not a thought yet, not fully, moving somewhere in the back of his mind like something waking up. Who's the heir? He asked. Phil's expression was careful and a little strange. A woman named Vivian Cross Ashford, he said. Goes by Vivian Cross in private life. Or she used to. She's recently begun using the full name publicly again. The room did not change. The light coming through the windows was the same light it had always been. Damien's hands resting on the table were the same hands. But something in the architecture of the last 11 years shifted so violently he was surprised it didn't make a sound. Vivian, he said. Not a question. He wasn't asking Phil to confirm it. He was saying her name because it was the only word available to him in that moment, the single syllable at the center of everything that was suddenly restructuring itself around him. Phil was quiet. He was giving Damien the moment, which was the only considerate thing to do. Damien thought about the way she had signed those papers, the steadiness of her hands, the particular quality of her calm, which he had always read as detachment or indifference but which he understood now, crashing through him now, had been something else entirely. She had not been absent. She had been contained. There is a profound difference between those two things, and he had been too certain of his own reading of her to see it. He thought about her refusing the $8 million. He thought about the specific phrasing. I never wanted your money. I never needed it. He thought about that key sitting in the kitchen drawer. She never used her family name, he said, more to himself than to Phil. No, Phil said. By all accounts, she lived entirely off the grid of her family's world during your marriage. She had no public presence connected to the Ashford name. Her father was apparently, he paused, selecting the word, protective of her privacy. He was protecting her from me, Damien said. Phil said nothing. From people like me. Damien stood up slowly and walked to the window. The city was out there, the same city, but he was looking at it differently now. He was looking at it the way you look at a stage set after you've understood it's a stage set. Technically the same object, but completely transformed. She walked into my life and she never told me, for 11 years. She may have had reasons for that, Phil said carefully. She had a reason. Damien's voice was flat. Not angry. Something stranger than anger. Something that would take him a long time to name. She wanted to know if someone would love her without knowing. Without the weight of all of it. He pressed his fingers against the glass. The city was cold and bright and very far below him. And I didn't. Phil was quiet for a long time. Then, Damien, the question we need to answer right now is whether she's actively directing these contract terminations or whether this is... She is, Damien said. She is, and you know it, and so do I. He turned back to the room. His face was strange even to himself. She's not destroying me. She doesn't have to. She's just stopped. He heard his own words and felt something hollow move through him. She stopped holding it together. That's all this is. Phil waited. Get me everything you can on the Ashford Consortium, Damien said. Everything public. I need to understand what I'm looking at. He straightened his jacket. His hands were not quite steady. He noticed this and stilled them deliberately. And get Sandra in here. We need to rebuild from the ground up because I don't think those relationships are coming back. Phil nodded and left. Damien stood at the window for another 5 minutes. He thought about the morning he had woken up and decided he was done. How clean it had felt. How light. He thought about Vivian's voice, even and unhurried, saying, "Be careful." He thought about the way he had laughed. Outside, the city went about its day, entirely indifferent to the thing coming apart behind this glass. And he stood there inside it, beginning, slowly and painfully, to understand how much of what he had called his world had been quietly and faithfully held together by hands he had never thought to look at. Phil Reyes left the conference room and Damien stayed at the window for longer than he intended. That was the part he wouldn't tell anyone later. Not his lawyers, not his board, not Chris Doyle, who would have listened without judgment. He stayed at that window for close to 20 minutes, watching the city move below him, and he did not think about strategy or vendor replacement or investor calls. He thought about a Tuesday morning 11 years ago when Vivian Cross had walked into a charity benefit at the Fairmont, wearing a dark blue dress and no particular expression of interest in anything around her, and he had crossed the room to talk to her because something in that self-containment had pulled at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He had told her somewhere in that first conversation that he was building something. The way men like him always said it, with the capital letters audible, building something, as though the universe had been waiting for exactly this particular man to arrive and begin. Vivian had looked at him and said, "What kind of something?" He had explained Sterltech, the vision, the market gap, the scalability model. He had been 20 minutes into it before he registered that she was actually listening, not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but real listening, the kind that came with small, precise questions that indicated she understood the architecture of what he was describing. He had found that extraordinary at the time. Standing at the window now, he understood something about that memory that he hadn't known how to see before. She had known exactly what he was building. She had come from a world that built things at a scale he was only beginning to imagine, and she had sat there and listened to him explain enterprise software, market penetration, as though it were the most interesting thing she'd encountered all year. She had given him that. He pressed his forehead lightly against the glass, and the cold came through, and he straightened up and called Sandra Kwan. "I need you in my office," he said. "Bring whoever you need." Quote. What followed was 3 weeks of the most concentrated operational scrambling Sterltech had attempted in its history, and Damien drove it personally, which meant 18-hour days, an office that smelled like coffee and stress, and a level of granular involvement in vendor logistics that he hadn't exercised since the early years when there had been no one else to exercise it. He was good in a crisis. He had always been good in a crisis, and this was true even now, even when the crisis was one he had, though he was not yet fully ready to say this plainly, helped create. He could compartmentalize, he could focus, he could look at a collapsing system and find the load-bearing elements and shore them up in sequence, and he brought that capacity to bear on Sterltech's vendor situation with everything he had. It helped, partially. They found a replacement for Nova Logistics within 10 days, a regional firm that wasn't as well integrated but could handle the Western deployments adequately. The Halloran integration stabilized when his engineering team rebuilt part of the Prescott pipeline internally, which was expensive and inelegant but functional. 2 of the 3 enterprise contracts that had been at SLA risk were secured with direct conversations and aggressive service commitments. The third one, Dynacorp, was not. Damien had flown to Dallas specifically for the Dynacorp meeting, which should have been a sign of how seriously he was taking it. Dynacorp's CTO, a straight-talking Texan named Gerald Marsh, who had been a Sterltech client since the early days, met him in a glass-walled conference room and shook his hand with the specific warmth of someone who was about to say something unfortunate. "Damien," Gerald said, "I'm going to be honest with you because I think you deserve honest." "Please," Damien said. "We've had 3 approaches in the last 2 weeks. Good approaches, serious money, enterprise-grade platforms, and a level of relationship management that—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Frankly, it made us realize how long it's been since we had that kind of attention from a vendor's executive team." "Who approached you?" Gerald looked at him steadily. "I'm not at liberty to say, but I'll tell you this, whoever it is, they know your business. They knew exactly what our pain points were with your integration. They knew things that someone on the inside would know." Damien kept his face still. "And you're leaving." "We haven't signed anything, but I'd be lying if I said we weren't looking seriously." Gerald leaned forward slightly. "I like you personally, Damien. I've always liked you. But I'm running a technology operation for 40,000 employees, and I need to know my infrastructure partners are stable. Right now," he spread his hands, "you've got noise around you. I'm fixing the noise." "I know you believe that." Gerald's expression was not unkind. "But the company that approached us doesn't have noise. They've got something we haven't seen in a while. They've got certainty. You walk into a room with them and you feel it, like the foundation is solid and nobody's in a hurry because they don't have to be." Damien flew back to San Francisco that evening in a private cabin with a glass of water he didn't drink and a file on the Ashford Consortium he had read 4 times already. The certainty Gerald was describing, he knew exactly what that felt like. He had felt it once, in the early years of Sterltech, when everything was moving and the momentum felt unbreakable, and he had attributed it to himself, to his drive and his vision and his specific capacity to make people believe. He understood now, somewhere he couldn't quite touch yet, that some portion of that certainty had not come from him. The Ashford Consortium file was not thick in the way you might expect from a 100-year-old private empire. It was thin and specific and notable mainly for its absences. No public financial disclosures, no press interviews, no board member photographs, no visible controversies or litigation. Just a series of known holdings and historical footnotes, and the occasional reference in trade publications as an unnamed stakeholder in transactions that had moved markets. What Damien had pieced together through Phil's contacts and 2 outside research firms he had retained under NDAs was this. Harlan Ashford had built the consortium from a position of inherited European manufacturing wealth and had spent 40 years transforming it into a global network of holdings that touched telecommunications, real estate, agricultural supply chains, shipping logistics, pharmaceutical distribution, and financial infrastructure. Not glamorous businesses, mostly. Not the kind of things that generated magazine covers, but the kind of things that everything else depended on, the invisible plumbing of commerce, functioning quietly beneath the surface of the economy. Harlan had been famously private, famously selective, and famously, according to the few people who had encountered him professionally, impossible to push around. He had a daughter. One daughter from his marriage to a woman named Eleanor Cross, who had died when the daughter was 12. Harlan had raised her privately, educated her at small institutions that didn't advertise their alumni, and had, apparently, made some arrangement with her in her adult years that allowed her to live outside the visible boundaries of the Ashford world. Her name was Vivian Cross Ashford. She had been known socially and professionally as Vivian Cross, She had for 11 years been married to Damian Sterling. Harlan had died 8 months ago. The transition of the consortium to Vivian had been managed quietly and was not publicly announced, which was entirely consistent with how the Ashford family operated. But within the last 60 days, roughly, Damian calculated, since around the time of the divorce filing, there had been movement. Vendors reassessing relationships, capital flows shifting, the kind of quiet repositioning that was invisible from the outside until the day it wasn't. He sat with all of this for a long time. He was not a stupid man. He was capable of reading a situation with clarity when he chose to. And what the situation said, reading it clearly, was this. Vivian had not orchestrated his destruction. She had simply, as he had said to Phil in the conference room that first afternoon, stopped. She had been present in his life and in the periphery of his business for 11 years, and her presence had included a layer of protection and facilitation that he had never known existed because it had been invisible and he had not thought to look. That was the specific cruelty of it. Not that she had planned to devastate him, but that her departure had revealed how little he had actually built on his own, and that revelation was happening not through her action, but through her absence. Marcus Webb knocked on his office door at 7:30 on a Thursday evening and let himself in without waiting, which he only did when the news was worth doing it for. Meridian filed an injunction, Marcus said. Damian looked up. What kind of injunction? They're claiming we owe them a breakup fee from the termination. The contract language is apparently ambiguous enough that their lawyers found an angle. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across the desk. It's probably not going to succeed, but it's going to cost us to fight it. And it's going to be public record. He paused. Reuters has already called our press office. Damian rubbed his eyes. What did press office say? No comment at this time, but that won't hold. No. Damian looked at his desk, at the organized surface that he maintained as a discipline because his mind functioned better when his physical environment was ordered. It was still organized, everything in its place. The organization now felt slightly absurd to him. A performance of control in a situation that was demonstrating how little of it he actually had. Get legal on the injunction tonight. I want a full assessment by morning. He looked at Marcus. How are you doing? Marcus blinked. It was an unusual question. Damian did not often stop to ask how people were doing in the middle of a crisis. I'm fine. Tired. How long have you been with me? 7 years. You've seen worse than this. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I've seen bad, he said carefully. I haven't seen... He stopped. Say it. I haven't seen something where I couldn't identify what caused it. Every other crisis we've had, I could point at the thing. Bad product cycle, regulatory issue, acquisition that went sideways, whatever. This... He gestured vaguely. This feels like the floor is giving way for a reason I can't see, and that's the part I don't know what to do with. Damian nodded slowly. I know what caused it, he said. Marcus looked at him. I'll tell you when I've figured out what to do about it. Damian stood. Go home. Get some sleep. Be back at 8. After Marcus left, Damian sat in the quiet office and did something he rarely did. He called his mother. Eleanor Sterling was 71 years old, sharp-minded, and had been telling Damian uncomfortable truths since he was old enough to hear them. She lived in Chicago, in the house she'd refused to leave after his father died, and she answered on the third ring with the particular alertness of someone who never quite fully slept anymore. It's late, she said. I know, I'm sorry. Don't apologize. What's wrong? The company is having a difficult period. That's not why you called at 10 o'clock. He was quiet for a moment. Vivian, he said. His mother said nothing. He tried to find a way to say it that didn't sound like what it was. He couldn't find one. She's Harlan Ashford's daughter, the Ashford Consortium. She had this entire other world, this entire mom. She never told me. 11 years. Eleanor was silent for long enough that he thought the line had dropped. Mom, I'm here. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful. Damian, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to actually think before you answer. Okay. Did you ever ask her? He opened his mouth to say, ask her what? And then he stopped, because he understood the question. His mother was asking whether he had ever sat across from Vivian Cross Sterling, and asked her, sincerely, who she was. Not what she did, not what she needed, not what her plans were for a dinner event or a quarterly travel schedule. Who she was. He sat with that question for what felt like a very long time. "No," he said finally. "No," his mother repeated. Not with judgment. Eleanor Sterling had never been a woman who led with judgment, but with a flatness that was almost more difficult to bear. "You didn't ask her, and she didn't volunteer it, and now you're surprised." "I'm not surprised that she didn't tell me. I understand why she didn't tell me." He pushed back from the desk and looked at the ceiling. I'm surprised that I never made her feel like the answer would have mattered." There was a silence between them, and in the silence was everything his mother didn't say, which was its own kind of conversation. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked. "About the company, I have a plan. It's not a good plan yet, but it'll be adequate. About the other thing." He stopped. "I don't know. I don't think there's anything to do. I don't think she's interested in being approached." "Probably not," his mother said, "but that's not always the point of doing something." He didn't know what to do with that, so he thanked her and told her he loved her, and got off the call. He sat in his office until midnight, and in the morning he found out the stock had dropped another 4% on the news of the Meridian injunction. Robert Liang came to him that same morning with the investor situation, which had moved from noise to movement. "One of the institutional holders has reduced their position," Robert said. He had the practiced calm of someone delivering information they knew was going to land badly. 11% of their Sterltech stake. It happened at market open. He put a printed report on the desk. It's not a panic sell. It's a deliberate measured reduction, which means they're watching and they've decided this is the time to lighten up. Who else is watching? Everyone who's watching them, which is, Robert exhaled, most of the institutional community. When a holder of that size and reputation moves, people notice. What's the message it sends? That someone who knows a lot about this company thinks the current risk profile doesn't match the price. Robert sat down. "Damien, I need you to give me something, some kind of narrative I can work with when the calls come in. Right now I'm making arguments that I can't quite close because I don't have enough information about what's actually happening. What do they want to know? They want to know if the vendor issues are structural or situational. They want to know if there's something in the company's relationships with partners that they should have known about and didn't. They want to know..." He stopped. "They want to know if there's a story they missed," Damien said. Yes. There was, of course. There was an enormous story they had all missed. The story was that the wife no one had particularly paid attention to had been, in ways none of them understood, quietly woven into the fabric of what they thought they were investing in. But Damien could not tell Robert Liang that story, because it was simultaneously the truest explanation and the most impossible one to make useful in an investor call. "Tell them the vendor situation is situational," Damien said. "Tell them we're 3 weeks into a proactive infrastructure diversification. Tell them the Dynacorp situation is complex but not lost." He paused. "Tell them I'm taking personal ownership of the recovery strategy and that I'll have a comprehensive briefing for major holders within 30 days. Robert nodded, writing. "And will you?" "Yes." "Okay." Robert stood. At the door he paused. "For what it's worth, the ones I've talked to aren't hostile. They're uncertain. There's a difference." "I know," Damien said. "Uncertain is manageable. Keep them uncertain rather than decisive, and we have time." Us. Celeste called at noon. He had been seeing her with decreasing regularity over the past 3 weeks. Not deliberately, but the crisis had consumed him in ways that made anything outside it feel remote and slightly unreal. She called from her office, and her voice had the careful register of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say. "I've been reading about Sterltech," she said. "Most people have." "Damien." She was quiet for a moment. "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Is what's happening connected to the divorce?" He considered several answers. He chose honesty, partly because he was too tired for the alternative. "It's complicated." "I'm asking directly because She stopped. Started again. "When we started seeing each other, you told me the marriage had been over for a long time, that she was essentially a stranger to your life." "That's what I believed." "And now?" "Now I know I was wrong about that." He heard his own voice and recognized that it sounded different than it had 3 weeks ago. Something had gone out of it, some specific quality of confidence. Not entirely. The man who closed deals and ran boards was still functional, still operational. But in this register, this private register, something had shifted. She wasn't a stranger to my life. I treated her like she was. The silence stretched. That's honest, Celeste said finally. I'm having a very honest week. She laughed. A little. Not because it was funny, but because it was the human response to something that was too heavy for the moment. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I needed to know what I'm standing next to. I'm not sure I know yet either, he said. He meant it as a statement about the company. It was also true about himself. Sandra Kwan appeared in his doorway at 3 in the afternoon with an expression that told him there was something she'd found and was working out how to present it. Talk, Damien said. She sat down. She had a tablet in her hand and she set it on the desk, turned toward him, showing him a financial network diagram that looked like something a particularly ambitious spider had built. I've been mapping the consortium's holdings against our vendor list, she said. Not just the direct relationships, indirect ones. Second-degree connections. Companies that have relationships with companies that have relationships with them. Damien looked at the diagram. That's extensive, Sandra said. Yes. She pointed at clusters. Our cloud hosting. Our payment processing infrastructure. Our European distribution channel. Our primary engineering talent pipeline comes from 2 universities whose endowment funds have consortium holdings. Our insurance carrier is majority owned by a holding entity with consortium ties. She sat back. I went looking for where they touched our business, and I found that it's... She paused. It's easier to map where they didn't. Damien looked at the diagram for a long time, the spider web of it, the way the lines radiated outward and intersected and crossed back. How long has this been in place? He asked. Some of it predates your company. The Ashford infrastructure is 100 years old in parts. But some of these specific relationships, she pointed at several nodes. These were established in the first 2 years of Sterltech's existence, before you had the revenue to attract these partners independently. The first 2 years of Sterltech's existence, when he had met Vivian, when they had married, 11 months after that charity benefit at the Fairmont, he thought about a question he hadn't let himself ask directly until now. Had she known when she met him? Had she understood on some level what her presence in his life would quietly enable? He would never ask her that. He already knew the answer would be too complicated to be useful to him. What he knew, what Sandra's diagram was confirming in the specific language of supply chains and financial connections, was that for 11 years he had been the visible top of a structure that extended beneath him in ways he had never once examined. He had called it his company and his empire and something he had built, and all of those things were true in the way that the top floor of a building is real. But you cannot have a top floor without everything beneath it. Sandra, he said. Yeah. You've worked here for 5 years. 6. In your assessment, he chose his words carefully. In your assessment, is this company viable without those connections? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the diagram. She was one of those people who took honesty seriously enough to be slow about it. Partially viable, she said finally. The core product is real. The technology is solid. The engineering team is good. Without the infrastructure layer, she gestured at the diagram, we'd be smaller. We'd be fighting harder for every contract we've taken for granted. Some of what we've built wouldn't have been buildable. She looked at him. Does that answer your question? Yeah, he said. It does. After she left, he sat with that answer. Partially viable. The core product is real. He had built something. That was true. The thing he had built was smaller and harder than the thing he thought he'd built, but it existed. It was real. The technology worked, and the people were good, and the fundamental market insight that had gotten him out of that borrowed office in San Jose had been genuinely his. That was something. It was less than he had believed, and it was something. He pulled up his email and stared at the empty compose window for a full minute before closing it. He wanted to write to Vivian. He had no idea what he would say. He had enough self-awareness left to understand that anything he wrote right now would be contaminated by his situation, that she would read it as a man trying to mitigate his losses, and that he could not honestly tell her she would be wrong. He closed the compose window. Quote, the board called an emergency session for the following Monday. Rosamund Fisher called him privately on Sunday evening. I'm going to be honest with you before tomorrow, she said. I'd appreciate that. The board isn't moving against you. Nobody has an appetite for a leadership crisis on top of everything else. Her voice was measured. But there are questions about what we didn't know, specifically about the degree to which your company's operational foundation was intertwined with external factors that weren't disclosed in any board communication. I didn't know, Damien said. I understand that. She paused. That's part of what we need to discuss. The implication was clear, and she was decent enough to let him process it without spelling it out. A CEO who didn't know the nature of his own company's operational dependencies was a CEO whose competence had a significant question mark next to it. What do you need from me? He asked. Honestly, I need you to come in tomorrow with a clear account of the situation, a viable path forward, and she seemed to consider the next part. And whatever degree of ownership you're able to take. Nobody expects perfection, but they need to see that you understand what happened. He was quiet for a moment. I understand what happened. Do you? The question sat there. Yes, he said. I do. There was a kind of tiredness in his voice that he recognized as the sound of a man who has been carrying a version of himself that no longer fully fits and has not yet figured out what to put on instead. Rosamund Fisher, who was a perceptive woman, heard it. Get some sleep, she said. You're going to need to be sharp tomorrow. He tried. He lay in the large bedroom of the Marine House, with its high ceilings and its particular quiet, and sleep came in fragments and kept slipping away. At some point past 2 a.m, he got up and went downstairs and opened the kitchen drawer and took out Vivian's key. He sat at the kitchen island with it in his hand for a long time. It was a small, ordinary key, the kind that didn't advertise what it opened. He had assumed, when he found it, that it was something forgotten. Now he wasn't sure. Vivian did not forget things. In 11 years, he could count on one hand the number of times he had seen her lose track of something or fail to follow through on what she'd said she would do. She was one of those people for whom forgetting was essentially not a function she performed. She had left this key deliberately. Whether she had left it for him to find or simply left it was a distinction he couldn't resolve. He put it in his shirt pocket and went back upstairs. In the morning, he dressed carefully, ate something he didn't taste, drove into the city, and walked into the most difficult board meeting of his professional life. With the key in his jacket pocket and the knowledge, finally and without qualification, that the company he had built, the thing he had been proudest of, the achievement he had defined himself by for 2 decades, had always been partly someone else's gift. He said so to the board. Not in those words exactly, but in words close enough that the room was very quiet for a long time afterward. It was the most honest thing he had said in a professional setting in years, and when it was over, he felt neither lighter nor heavier, just different, like a house after they've opened all the windows and the air that comes through is cold and unfamiliar and very, very real. The board meeting ended without a vote of no confidence, which was the best thing Damien could say about it. Rosamund Fisher had kept the room from fracturing. He gave her credit for that. When 2 of the younger board members had begun pushing toward a formal review process, she had cut it off with the specific authority of someone who understood that a leadership crisis and an operational crisis happening simultaneously was how companies died. We fix the foundation first, she had said. Then we evaluate the architect. It was not a ringing endorsement of Damien, but it was a lifeline, and he took it without pretending it was more than what it was. He spent the 2 weeks following the board meeting doing the work. Not the visible work, not the press management and the investor calls and the strategic narrative, but the actual operational work, the kind that happened in windowless rooms with engineers and procurement specialists and legal teams going line by line through contracts, identifying what could be rebuilt and what would have to be abandoned. Sandra Kwan ran most of it. Damien was present for more of it than people expected, which he did partly because he needed to understand the granular reality of what his company actually was, without the infrastructure layer he had not known existed, and partly because showing up in those rooms was the only honest thing he could think to do. Marcus Webb resigned on a Wednesday morning. He came in person, which Damien respected. He sat across the desk and said, "I've been offered the COO position at Trellis Systems. It's a good opportunity, and I'm going to take it." He said it plainly, without the elaborate professional framing people usually constructed around these conversations. Is it the situation here? Damien asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was a man who didn't lie without necessity. It's part of it, he said. 7 years is also a long time. I've been thinking about a change for a while. He paused. The situation made the thinking louder. Damien nodded. I understand. I want you to know I'm not... Marcus stopped. Tried again. I'm not leaving because I think you're a bad leader. I'm leaving because I think this is going to be a long rebuild, and I'm not sure I have another long rebuild in me right now. That's honest. You deserve honest. He stood, and they shook hands, and Marcus Webb walked out of Sterltech after 7 years, and Damien sat in his office and felt the specific loneliness of a man watching his world reorganize itself around an absence he had created. He did not call Celeste that night. He called his mother again, briefly, and she asked how he was eating, and he told her fine, and she said she didn't believe him, but she wasn't going to push. And that small ordinariness of being known and not pushed was the closest thing to comfort he had that week. The technology press found the story in the 5th week. Not the full story. They didn't have the Vivian angle, or if they had pieces of it, they couldn't yet connect the dots publicly. What they had was the vendor departures, and the stock decline, and the Meridian injunction, and that was sufficient material for a class of narrative that the technology media produced with particular enthusiasm. The fall of a golden boy. The pieces ran under headlines like Cracks in the Sterling Empire and Sterltech's Q4 Turbulence, What's Behind the Exodus? They were not, individually, devastating. Collectively, they created an atmosphere of question marks around his company's name that Damien could feel in every conversation he had. Phil Reyes managed the press strategy with a competence that Damien genuinely appreciated, keeping the company's public statements brief and consistent, neither feeding the narrative nor creating a vacuum of silence that speculation would rush into. But there was only so much management could do against a sustained drip of unflattering attention, and Damien knew it. What he hadn't anticipated was where the real story would break first, and how. It came from a financial newsletter called Capital Architecture. Not a major publication, but the kind of thing that serious institutional investors and M&A professionals read carefully because it had a track record of being right before the mainstream caught up. The piece was titled The Silent Infrastructure: Who Really Built the Deals You Thought Were Sterling? And it was, by any measure, the most thorough account of the Ashford Consortium's quiet role in Sterltech's ecosystem that had been published anywhere. It didn't name Vivian directly, but it documented with the specific sourcing of someone who had been given access or had done extraordinary research, the network of consortium-adjacent relationships that had quietly enabled Sterltech's rise. It used words like facilitated and protected and adjacent support structures, and it stopped just short of saying explicitly what it was clearly implying. Damien read it at 6 in the morning at his kitchen table with cold coffee, and felt something he could only describe as the particular shame of being understood publicly before you'd finished understanding yourself privately. His phone began ringing at 6:40. He let most calls go to voicemail. He picked up when Phil's name appeared. "You've seen it," Phil said. "I've seen it. It's going to get picked up. By end of day, it'll be in the Journal, maybe the Times." Phil's voice had the tired precision of a man who had been awake managing this for hours. "We need to decide how we respond. What are our options? Denial, which I don't recommend because whoever wrote this has sources and denial will look worse when it unravels. Silence, which maintains some dignity but lets the narrative run without our voice. Or," Phil paused, "or we get ahead of it. We acknowledge that the company has operated within a broader ecosystem of relationships. We frame it as standard industry practice, and we make a clear statement about Sterltech's independent viability going forward." That last option requires us to actually be independently viable going forward. "Yes," Phil said. "Are we?" Damien looked at the kitchen counter. At the drawer where Vivian's key wasn't anymore. He had moved it. He wasn't sure where it was now. Somewhere in his bedside table, he thought. "Partially," he said, which was the word Sandra had used. He had borrowed it because it was precise. "Partially is workable," Phil said. "Partially is honest and survivable. Do you want me to draft something?" "Draft it. Run it by legal. Don't release anything until I've read it." He put the phone down and sat for another few minutes. The morning light was coming through the kitchen windows. The Marin house had good morning light. It had always had good morning light, and Vivian had chosen it partly for that reason. He had forgotten that. She had walked through the house on a Sunday afternoon during the showing and stood in the kitchen for a long time, not saying anything, and then had said this one, with the quiet certainty she brought to choices she'd thought through. He had closed on it within 2 weeks. He pulled his laptop toward him and opened a browser and searched, not for the first time, for public information about Vivian Cross Ashford. There was more than there had been. That was new. Scene. Vivian had not been invisible her entire life. She had simply been deliberately unpresent in the context where Damien operated. In the world that had known her as Harlan Ashford's daughter, there were traces. Photographs from private events in Geneva and Singapore and Sao Paulo, her name attached to philanthropic initiatives and educational endowments, references in European financial circles that described her as formidably prepared and not easily read. One profile from a Swiss business journal, dated 3 years before she met Damien, described her as someone who had been trained by her father in what the writer called the discipline of patience, the Ashford philosophy that real power moved slowly and left no fingerprints. After she met Damien, those traces had essentially stopped. She had stepped out of that world and into his, and the transition had been so complete that anyone looking at the public record of her life during the marriage would have found almost nothing worth noting. Now, in the 60 days since the divorce, she had stepped back. The announcements were subtle by the standards of what they were. A notice in the consortium's internal communications, which had been leaked to Capital Architecture, confirming the transition of leadership. A photograph that had circulated in private banking circles showing Vivian at a meeting of the Ashford Holdings Board. She was at the head of the table, which was itself a statement. And 2 days ago, a brief statement released under the Ashford name confirming that the consortium would be presenting a major technology initiative at the Global Technology Convergence Summit in Washington in 3 weeks. The GTC Summit. Damien knew it well. He had spoken there 4 times. It was the kind of event that functioned simultaneously as industry conference, investment showcase, and social occasion for the people who moved money through the technology sector, and it attracted the specific gravity of whoever was considered important enough to be on the main stage. Vivian had been added to the main stage program. Her name appeared on the updated agenda that had been released quietly 2 days ago, Vivian Cross Ashford, Ashford Consortium, unveiling Project Meridian. Not Meridian as in the vendor that had filed the injunction against Sterltech. A different Meridian. The name, he suspected, was not a coincidence. He stared at the listing for a long time. He had been registered for the GTC Summit for months. His participation had been arranged before any of this had happened, before the divorce, before everything. His team had assumed he would withdraw given the current climate. He had not yet told them either way. He picked up his phone and called Sandra. "I'm going to the summit," he said when she answered. A pause. "Damien, I know what it looks like. I'm going anyway." Another pause. "Is this about Vivian?" He didn't answer immediately. "It's about the company," he said. "If I withdraw, the story becomes CEO in hiding. If I attend, I'm a leader managing a difficult quarter like leaders do. I need to be in that room. And if she's in that room, then she's in that room." He kept his voice even. "Book the travel." Dishimquamt. The 3 weeks between that phone call and the summit were the strangest of Damien's professional life, and they had been preceded by the strangest 2 months of his professional life. So the competition was meaningful. Sterltech stabilized in the modest and partial way that the word stabilized covers a range of states, from recovering to no longer actively getting worse. They secured a replacement cloud infrastructure agreement with a firm out of Austin that was smaller than Meridian had been but technically sound. The Meridian injunction moved through preliminary hearings without producing any result that materially damaged them. Their legal team had found enough ambiguity in the other direction to make the case a slow grind rather than a fast wound. 2 of the institutional investors who had made noise in Robert Liang's early briefings had, after direct calls with Damien and Phil, held their positions. 1 had not. The stock sat at roughly 14% below its pre-divorce high, which Phil described as concerning but not existential. Damien had a conversation with Rosamund Fisher every Thursday. It had not been formally arranged, it had simply evolved, the way certain communication structures evolve in a crisis when they're useful. She would call at 4:30, they would talk for 40 minutes, and she would ask the kind of questions that forced him to think carefully rather than reactively. He found himself genuinely grateful for her, which was not a relationship he had ever expected to have with a board member. "How are you thinking about the summit?" she asked in the third Thursday call. "As an appearance of continuity," he said. "And actually," he considered, "as something I need to do even if it's uncomfortable, maybe especially because it's uncomfortable." "She's going to be there." "I know." "Damien." Rosamond's voice shifted slightly, the quality of someone deciding to say something they'd been holding. "I've been in this industry for 30 years. I've watched a lot of men fail in a lot of ways. The ones who recovered, genuinely recovered, not just stabilized, were the ones who got honest with themselves about what actually happened. Not the press version, not the board version, the actual version." He was quiet. "I think you're getting there," she said. "I just want you to keep going." He flew to Washington on a Sunday. The summit ran Monday through Wednesday. He had a suite at the hotel that the event used as its base, and he arrived to find that the lobby was already occupied by the particular density of important people that these events generated: executives and investors and policy people, and the specific class of journalists who covered the intersection of all three, moving through the marble space with the purposeful energy of people who understood they were being watched and had made their peace with it. He had been to this summit 4 times. He knew how to move through a room like this, who to speak to, how long to spend on each conversation, how to project the quality of assurance that these environments required. He did all of it on Monday. He attended panels. He had meals with contacts. He fielded the careful questions people asked about Sterltech with the measured honesty he had been practicing for weeks. Some of those conversations went better than he expected. A few investors who had been cooling told him they were watching with interest. A potential strategic partner he had been cultivating for months sat down with him for 45 minutes and seemed genuinely engaged. He did not see Vivian on Monday. He saw her name on every program and agenda throughout the day, in the context of her main stage presentation scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. And each time he saw it, he felt something complicated move through him that he did not spend time naming. He slept badly. He ordered room service he didn't finish. He lay in the dark hotel room and stared at the ceiling and thought, with the involuntary honesty of the sleepless, about 11 years of evenings in which Vivian had occupied the same space as him, the same bed, the same dinner tables, the same cars moving through the same city. And he had been so thoroughly located in his own interior weather that he had never properly asked about hers. He had not been cruel to her. He wanted to be clear about that, at least in his own accounting. He had not been dismissive or contemptuous or demeaning in the direct ways that made certain marriages recognizable catastrophes from the outside. He had simply been absent, present in body, absent in attention. The particular failure mode of a man who had confused ambition with aliveness and mistaken momentum for meaning. At 2 a.m, he got up, went to the window, and looked out at Washington in the dark, the monuments lit against the sky, the specific gravity of that city, and thought about what it would have cost him at any point in 11 years to stop and say, "Tell me who you are." Actually, the answer was nothing. It would have cost him nothing. He had simply never thought to do it. Bob. Tuesday's main stage presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the summit's largest room, a space that seated 1,200. By 1:40, it was full. Damien was there, in a seat toward the back. He had considered not attending this specific session. He had decided in the end that not attending was a kind of cowardice he didn't want to model for himself. The introduction was given by the summit's chair, a brief, factual accounting of the Ashford Consortium's history and the significance of this being their first major public technology presentation. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms are quiet when they're paying genuine attention rather than simply waiting. Vivian walked out from stage left. She was wearing charcoal, a structured suit, not severe but precise, the kind of clothing that said she had given the occasion appropriate thought without being dressed by it. Her hair was down, which surprised him for a moment before he understood it. She had always worn her hair back in contexts adjacent to his world, and he realized that had probably been, in some way he'd never considered, a form of minimizing. She wore her hair down and she walked to the center of the stage, and she stood for a moment before she spoke. Not because she was nervous, there was nothing in her posture that read as nervous, but because she was someone who understood the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was doing work. The room waited. I spent 11 years being invisible, she said. I want to start by acknowledging that because it's relevant to what I'm going to show you. She didn't explain further. She moved into the presentation. What followed was 45 minutes that Damien would later struggle to describe to people who hadn't been in the room, not because the content was technically complex. It was, but complexity can be communicated, but because of the quality of the thing itself. Vivian presented a platform called Meridian. Yes, deliberately named, she acknowledged the reference without belaboring it, an integrated AI infrastructure system that addressed the most persistent friction points in enterprise technology deployment, the gap between raw AI capability and functional organizational implementation. It was not a product looking for a market. It was a product that had clearly been built by someone who had spent years watching a market at close range, understanding its specific failures, and designing around them with the kind of patience that could only come from someone who wasn't in a hurry. She spoke without notes. She fielded technical questions from the audience with a directness that required genuine depth. When one investor asked about go-to-market strategy, she gave him an answer that included specific deployment timelines, specific client categories, and specific infrastructure investments, numbers that indicated she had not just conceived of this, but had been building it, quietly, for years. She acknowledged what the platform didn't yet do with the same ease she described what it did, which was the specific confidence of someone who didn't need to oversell. The room gave her a standing ovation, not the polite kind, the kind that comes up from people before they've quite decided to stand, the spontaneous kind that industry rooms very rarely produce because the people in them have seen a great deal and are not easily moved. Damien sat in his seat while the room stood around him. He was not diminished by what he was watching, or rather, he was diminished in the way that accurate information diminishes a false belief, which is a diminishment you eventually feel grateful for, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment. He was watching Vivian Cross Ashford do something extraordinary, and he understood, in the specific ache of it, that this person had been adjacent to his life for 11 years, and he had not once, sat across from her and said, "Show me what you are." He had not deserved her. He had not been worth the quiet patience she had offered him, and she had not needed to stay. She had chosen to, for reasons he would never fully know, and he had thrown that choice across a mahogany desk in a manila envelope and called it a settlement. When the applause began to quiet and people started moving toward her, Damien stayed in his seat. He was not ready yet. And he understood enough about himself, in this changed and uncomfortable version of himself that the last 2 months had been constructing, to know that not ready was worth honoring. He saw her properly for the first time that evening at the summit reception, a large affair in the hotel's grand ballroom, the kind of event where the crowd was thick enough that you could choose how visible you were. He had been there for 40 minutes, moving through conversations with the particular care of a man managing his social presence in a room that contained both his professional stakeholders and his ex-wife. When he turned from a conversation with an investment manager and found Vivian standing 6 feet away. She was speaking with 2 people he didn't recognize, not facing him, turned slightly to her left. Then whoever she was speaking with looked past her shoulder toward Damien, and something in that glance made her follow it, and their eyes met. She did not look away immediately. Neither did he. There was a moment, brief, perhaps 3 seconds, but with the density of something much longer, and then she excused herself from her conversation and walked toward him, and he held himself very still. "Damien," she said. "Vivian." He stopped. There were many things he had considered saying if this happened. None of them arrived. What came out instead was, "Your presentation was extraordinary." She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "Thank you," she said, sincere, not deflecting. Vivian Cross Ashford did not deflect compliments with false modesty. She accepted them and moved on. "I mean it," he said, "not as—" He stopped himself from finishing the sentence with something self-referential. "It was genuinely excellent. The platform, the presentation, how you handled the room, all of it. I've been working on it for a long time," she said. "I know." He hadn't meant to say that. It acknowledged too much. But it was out, and she heard it, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, not softening exactly, but registering. "How is the company?" she asked. He respected the directness of it. He matched it. "Difficult, stabilizing partly. I'm learning what I actually built versus what I thought I built, and those are 2 different things." She nodded once, slowly. That's usually how it works, she said. Vivian. He heard his own voice change register slightly, and he didn't try to prevent it. I owe you. He stopped. He had rehearsed this sentence in fragments for weeks, and none of the versions were adequate. I owe you more than I know how to say in this context, and I'm not going to try to say it here because you deserve better than a reception conversation. He held her gaze. But I want you to know that I understand what I didn't understand before. About you. About the marriage. About what I... He stopped again. About what I failed to do. The room continued around them. Voices and glassware, and the ambient performance of professional sociability. Vivian stood in the middle of it, with her full attention on him, which was, he recognized, exactly what she had always been capable of, and exactly what he had never reciprocated. I know you understand it now, she said. Her voice was quiet and not unkind. I believe that. But? He said it carefully because the sentence felt unfinished. She considered him for a moment. No, but, she said, I believe you understand it. That matters. She held his gaze steadily. Understanding it now doesn't revise what happened. It just... She paused. It just means you're going to be a different person going forward than you were, if you do the work. I'm doing the work, he said. I know. Something moved across her face. Not warmth exactly, more complex than warmth. I watch the same industry you do, Damien. I know what Sterltech is going through. I know how you've been handling it. She paused. I'm not trying to destroy you. I want you to know that. I'm not sitting somewhere managing your downfall. I stopped. I stepped back. What happened after that is, she looked away briefly toward the room and then back. It's the natural consequence of what was there and what wasn't. I didn't engineer it. I know, he said. And he did know. That understanding had taken him weeks to arrive at, but he was there. I know it was me. She looked at him for another moment, then she said, I need to get back to my people. She tilted her head slightly toward the cluster of Ashford associates waiting at a respectful distance. It's good to see you, Damien, in spite of everything. It's good to see you, he said, genuinely. She nodded once, not a goodbye exactly, more an acknowledgement, and she turned and walked back toward her world, and Damien watched her go with the particular sensation of a man watching a door close and understanding, finally, that he was the one who had shut it a long time ago. He gave his own presentation the following morning. It was the last thing on the summit's agenda that involved him, and he had reworked it twice in the past 2 weeks to reflect a reality that was less polished than the version he had originally prepared. He stood at the podium before a room of about 400, smaller than Vivian's crowd, he noticed, and didn't let himself wince, and talked about Sterltech with a directness that surprised people. He could see it in the room. He talked about what the company had gotten right and what it had gotten wrong. He talked about infrastructure dependencies that had been invisible and were no longer. He talked about the difference between a company built on relationships you understood and a company built on relationships you had taken for granted. He was careful not to say anything that was legally inadvisable, but within those constraints he was as honest as he had been in any professional context in years. A journalist approached him afterward, a woman who covered enterprise technology for a major publication and who had a reputation for thoroughness. That was an unusual talk, she said. In what way? Most CEOs in your current position give talks about resilience and confidence and the strength of their platform. She studied him. You gave a talk about what you didn't know. What I didn't know was more important than what I knew, he said. I thought the reverse was true for a long time. She wrote something in her notebook. Would you say that the difficulties Sterltech has been experiencing have changed how you lead? He thought about Rosamund Fisher's Thursday calls, about Sandra's network diagram and the spiderweb of lines connecting things he had never examined, about Vivian standing in the kitchen doorway of the Moran house on that showing day, saying this one in a voice that trusted something she saw that he had been too busy looking elsewhere to notice. They've changed how I see, he said. The leading comes after. The journalist wrote something else. He didn't know what the article would say when she wrote it, and he found he minded less than he once would have. Not because he'd stopped caring about how his company was perceived, he hadn't, but because the specific anxiety of needing to control the narrative had loosened its grip on him somewhat, the way certain grips loosen when you've been through something that demonstrates what your actual losses can look like. He flew home that evening. In the car from the airport, he looked out the window at the Bay Bridge and thought about the morning 2 months ago when he had crossed it on the way to work, feeling lighter than he had in years, convinced he had made a clean decision and was moving towards something better. He had been moving. He had been wrong about the direction. The city lights ran along the water, and he watched them and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the residual low-grade grief, and the very real professional anxiety that was not going away anytime soon, something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The beginning of a shape. The possibility of something he hadn't been able to name because he had been, for a very long time, too sure of himself to leave room for it. He put his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He had a lot of work to do. He knew that clearly. The company needed rebuilding, and his understanding of himself needed rebuilding, and those were parallel projects that were both going to require more patience than he was naturally inclined toward. But he was, for the first time in longer than he could pinpoint, genuinely uncertain about how things would turn out. And that uncertainty, which he had spent his entire adult life treating as a problem to be solved, felt in this moment like something closer to the truth. The article ran on a Thursday. It appeared in the technology section of a publication that Damien had been quoted in dozens of times over the years, always favorably, always in the context of his company's growth, or his industry vision, or the specific mythology of a man who had built something significant from almost nothing. The journalist from the summit had written it carefully. He could see that. She hadn't gone for blood. She had simply written what was true, which turned out to be more damaging than sensationalism would have been. The piece was titled Sterling's Reckoning: What Happens When the Foundation Isn't What You Built. It was 4,000 words, and it documented, with sourced precision, the gap between the Sterltech that Damien had publicly described for a decade and the Sterltech that the last 3 months had revealed. It referenced the Ashford Consortium by name. It described the vendor dependency structure with accuracy that made Damien wonder, briefly, who the journalist's sources were before he stopped wondering because it didn't matter anymore. It quoted him from the summit, his line about not knowing being more important than knowing, and placed it in a context that made it read as the admission it was. The piece was not cruel. It was not even particularly hostile. It was the specific kind of journalism that is most difficult to manage because it simply holds a mirror up with steady hands. Phil Reyes called at 7 that morning. "I've read it," Damien said before Phil could speak. "Okay." A pause. "The board is going to want a call." "I know." "Today? Probably." "Set it up." He put the phone down and sat at the kitchen table in the Marine House and read the piece one more time from the beginning. He had learned over the past months to read coverage of himself without the defensive reflex that had once been automatic, the immediate scanning for inaccuracies, the mental drafting of responses, the instinct to frame and counter and manage. He had learned to read it as information, to ask, "Is this true?" And if the answer was yes, to sit with that instead of reaching for the antidote. Most of it was true. He put the laptop down and went upstairs and looked in the mirror while he shaved, which was not something he had done with any particular attention for most of his adult life. He was 43 years old, and he looked like a man who had not been sleeping enough for 3 months, which was accurate. He had lines around his eyes that had deepened and a particular quality of tightness in his face that he recognized as the physical expression of sustained stress. He looked like someone who was going through something. He thought, good, at least the outside matches. The board call lasted 2 hours. Rosamund Fisher opened it, which had become the established pattern. She was the steadying voice, the one who kept the conversation from becoming either too combative or too consolatory. The range of responses from the board members surprised him slightly. He had expected more pressure toward his removal. What he got instead was more complicated. 3 members who clearly thought the situation required a leadership change and were making that argument with careful professional language. 2 who were aligned with Rosamund in the position that stability required continuity, and the remaining 4 who were somewhere in the uncertain middle, watching, listening, not yet committed. The member who pushed hardest for change was a man named Victor Hale, a private equity veteran who had joined Sterltech's board 4 years ago and who operated with the particular directness of someone who measured outcomes rather than processes. The article establishes a credibility problem, Victor said, not because of what it says about the past, but because of what it implies about the present. If the company's operational structure was opaque to its own CEO, that's an information problem that lives in leadership. I've acknowledged that, Damien said. Acknowledging it publicly is good optics. It doesn't fix the structural issue. What would fix it, in your view? Victor was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. A transition period. Announcement that you're stepping back from day-to-day operations while the company completes its infrastructure rebuild. Bring in an interim COO with operational credibility. Your role becomes strategic oversight while the operational house gets put in order. That's not a leadership change, Damien said. That's a performance of a leadership change. It might be what the market needs to see right now. Rosamond stepped in. Let's be direct about what we're deciding. Victor's proposal isn't removal, it's restructuring. Damien, what's your position? Damien looked at his desk, at his hands on the desk. He had been in difficult board meetings before. They were part of the cost of doing business at this level, and he had navigated them with the particular combination of data and charm and sheer force of personality that had characterized his leadership for 20 years. He did not reach for any of those tools right now. My position, he said, is that Victor is not wrong about the credibility problem. The article is accurate. The situation is what it is. He paused. What I'd push back on is the idea that the answer to a leadership problem is a cosmetic leadership change. If the board wants me to step back, I think that decision should be made genuinely, not as optics management. Silence. If the board's honest view is that Sterltech needs different leadership to complete this rebuild, I'll accept that. I'm not going to fight it. I'm going to ask that the decision be made honestly and not dressed up as a strategic restructuring when it's actually a vote of no confidence. He felt the room's attention shift. I'd rather lose the position cleanly than keep it through a fiction. Rosamond said, That's a significant statement. It's an honest one. The call continued for another 40 minutes. No vote was called that day. Rosamond steered them away from a vote, citing the need for a formal process. Buying time that Damien understood was the last runway he was likely to get. But the conversation had shifted in a direction he hadn't fully anticipated, and when the call ended, he sat in his quiet office and recognized that he had just made, possibly, the most honest professional statement of his career. He was not sure it would save him. He was not sure that was the point. 2 weeks after the article, Sterltech stock hit its lowest point since the company's third year of operation. It closed at $31.40 on a Tuesday afternoon. Phil Reyes texted him the number with no additional commentary because there was no additional commentary to add. Damien looked at the number on his phone, then put the phone face down on his desk and spent the next 3 hours in back-to-back calls with the operations team, working through the infrastructure rebuild timeline. Sandra Kwan had become, in the absence of Marcus Webb, and in the general restructuring of Sterltech's leadership layer, functionally the most important person in the company after Damien himself. She ran the rebuild with a thoroughness and a lack of drama that he had come to genuinely rely on, and on the Thursday evening following the stock low, she sat across from him in his office after everyone else had left and said what she'd been working up to for a week. I need to ask you something, and I need you not to manage me when you answer, she said. He looked up. Okay. What's the plan? The real plan. Not the board version or the investor version. What do you actually think is going to happen to this company? He was quiet for a moment. This was the specific kind of question he had spent 20 years training himself not to answer honestly in professional contexts. Because honest answers to this question could become liabilities, could be taken out of context, could undermine the confidence that companies ran on. He had lived by the principle that a leader's doubts were private possessions, and his public face was the face of certainty. He was very tired of that principle. I think the core survives, he said. The product is real. The technology is solid. I've believed that since the beginning, and I still believe it. He paused. I think the company that survives is going to be smaller than the company we thought we were. I think some of what we lost, the vendor relationships, the infrastructure layer, is genuinely gone, and we are not getting it back, and the company we rebuild is going to have to be leaner and more independent than the version that existed before. Sandra nodded, watching him carefully. I also think, he said, that there is a non-trivial probability that the board moves toward a leadership change in the next 60 days. Victor Hale is building a case, and he's not wrong that he has one. He held her gaze. I'm not telling you that to alarm you. I'm telling you because you asked me honestly, and because you deserve to know the actual landscape you're working in. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. If there's a leadership change, the rebuild continues. Whoever comes in will inherit the work you've already done, which is considerable. He paused. And Sandra, if that happens, I'm going to make sure the board understands clearly who actually kept this company functional during the hardest part. She looked at him in a way that was difficult to read, something between surprise and a careful reassessment. She stopped. That's not how you operated before. No, he said. It's not. She gathered her things and stood up. At the door she paused, and he thought she was going to say something else, but what she said was simply, "Get some rest, Damien." It was the first time she had used his first name without the structure of a meeting around it. He noticed. Celeste ended things on a Saturday. She came to the Marin house in person, which he respected even as he understood what the in-person visit meant before she said anything. She sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where he had drunk cold coffee reading the Summit article, where he had sat with Vivian's key in his hands in the dark. And she looked at him with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and discovered, upon beginning it, that the rehearsed version wasn't quite right. I've been trying to figure out how to say this without it sounding like I'm leaving because things are hard, she started. Are you leaving because things are hard? He asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. She thought about it, really thought, which he appreciated. Partly, she said, but not just that. She looked at her hands, then back at him. I think I fell for a version of you that was, I don't know how to say this exactly, a version of you that was very sure of everything. And I found it compelling. I find certainty compelling. I'm less certain now, he said. I know. Her voice was careful. And I think that version of you is probably better, more real. But it's also... She stopped again. I'm not sure I know how to be with the uncertain version. That's a me problem, not a you problem. He looked at her for a moment. Celeste Harmon was a smart and capable woman, and she was being honest with him, and he owed her the same. I think, he said, that I wasn't fully present with you either. I need to say that. The past few months, I've been somewhere else, she said. Yes. She nodded slowly. They sat in the kitchen quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like the quiet of two people acknowledging something together that didn't require more words. I hope the company finds its footing, she said when she stood up. She meant it. He could hear that she meant it. Thank you, he said, for being honest today. You didn't have to do this in person. Yes, I did, she said simply, and then she left, and Damien sat at the kitchen table and felt not devastated, but something lonelier than devastation, the particular solitude of someone who can see clearly, for the first time, the full shape of their own patterns. He had spent his entire adult life seeking out people who reflected his certainty back to him. Celeste, with her electric energy, the challenge she provided, the way she made him feel like a man who still had something to prove. Even the early years with Vivian, before her steadiness had started to feel like absence to him, what had drawn him was her self-containment, the quality of someone who didn't need him to perform. He had mistaken that quality for simplicity. It was the furthest thing from it. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the Marion Hills in the gray November afternoon and thought about what it might mean to build a life, not a company, not a professional legacy, a life, in which he wasn't primarily looking for mirrors. The board voted 6 weeks after the summit. It was not the clean outcome Victor Hale had been building toward. It was messier than that, which turned out to be more representative of how most things actually resolved when the people involved were operating in good faith and genuine uncertainty rather than performing a predetermined conclusion. The vote was not a removal. It was, as Victor had originally proposed, a restructuring, but negotiated over 6 weeks into something that Damien had shaped rather than simply accepted. He would remain as chairman with a reduced executive role, while Sterl Tech recruited a COO with specific operational infrastructure experience to run the rebuild. His equity position remained unchanged. His public role would evolve, Less the face of daily operations, more the strategic voice of the company's longer-term direction. It was less than he had held. It was more than he deserved, possibly. He accepted it with the same honesty he had brought to the board meeting 2 months earlier, without performance, without relief that outran the reality of what was happening. Rosamond called him privately after the vote. "How are you?" she asked. "Okay," he said. And then, "No, I'm actually okay. That's not a performance." "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference." He spent the next 2 weeks in transition meetings, briefing candidates for the COO role, documenting institutional knowledge, having the specific and sometimes painful conversations about operational decisions that would have been made differently if he had known then what he knew now. He was thorough, and he was honest, and he thought, more useful in these conversations than he had been in many conversations over the past several years, because he was no longer managing impressions. He was just describing what was true. The Marine House went on the market in December. He had made the decision before the board vote, which surprised his attorney and his real estate agent and his mother, who had called to ask if he was sure. "I'm sure," he said. "It's a beautiful house," she said. "It's too much house." He looked around the kitchen, the high ceilings, the morning light that fell through the windows in the particular way that Vivian had stood in and said this one. "I don't need it." "What do you need?" He thought about this. "Something smaller," he said, "something that fits what's actually true right now." He found an apartment in the city, not modest by most standards, but modest by the standards of what he had occupied for the past decade. 2 bedrooms, a small terrace, a view that was nice without being the kind of view that announced something. He moved in on a Saturday with the help of 2 people from the building and a moving company that had no particular opinion about who he was, which felt appropriate. He put almost nothing on the walls. He kept the furniture simple. He had fewer things than he expected to have, and found that this was not, actually, the deprivation he might have predicted. The acquisition offer came in February. He had known it was coming in the abstract, when a company of Trillionaire's size showed the kind of vulnerabilities they had shown over the past several months. It entered a category of interest for larger entities looking for undervalued technology assets. He had not known from whom, or when, or in what form. The offer came from the Ashford Consortium's newly established technology division, the entity that housed Vivian's Meridian platform and several adjacent acquisitions she had been quietly assembling since stepping into the consortium's leadership. The offer was for Trillionaire's core technology assets, the enterprise software platform, the engineering team, the client relationships, not the whole company, not the name, not the structural remnants of the broader organization, the technology, the part that Damien had actually built. Phil Reyes called him at 8 in the morning and read the terms. Damien listened without interrupting. The offer was fair. It was better than fair. It valued the core technology at a number that acknowledged its genuine worth rather than its distressed circumstances. Damien's attorney, reviewing it that afternoon, said, "This is a good offer. This is not a predatory offer. Whoever structured this valued the asset on its merits." Damien sat with the offer for 3 days. He sat with it not because the decision was financially complicated. The analysis was not difficult, and he could see what it said, but because accepting it required him to hold in his mind simultaneously the understanding that this was the right outcome for the technology and the people who had built it, and the knowledge that the entity receiving it was Vivian's. Both things were true. He was not going to let the second thing contaminate the first. On the 3rd day, he called the board. The recommendation was unanimous, accept. He signed the acquisition documents on a Thursday morning in a conference room with his attorney and Phil Reyes and 2 Ashford legal representatives he had not previously met. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when significant things are being done. He read every page, actually read them, which his attorney had expected he wouldn't bother to do, and signed where indicated with a pen he had carried in his jacket pocket for years, a simple thing his father had left him. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected grief or bitterness or the specific hollow sensation of losing something you had built over decades. What he felt was more complicated and more ordinary, a tiredness that had been in him for months, and that this, in some way, partially released. Like setting down a weight he had not acknowledged he was carrying. The Ashford representatives were professional and pleasant and asked no personal questions, for which he was quietly grateful.
He had been mentoring Oren informally and without announcing it for several months by the time the acquisition closed. It had started accidentally, a chance conversation at a small entrepreneurship event in January, where he had ended up at a side table talking to a 26-year-old founder who was terrified and brilliant and asking the exact kind of questions that Damien now had genuine answers to. Not the answers he would have given 2 years ago, the polished version, the success narrative, the scaffolding of confident lessons drawn from a record he no longer fully recognized. The actual answers. The ones that included what he had gotten wrong and what the getting wrong had cost, and what he had understood on the other side of it. The conversation had lasted 2 hours. The founder, a young woman named Priya, who was building a supply chain analytics platform on a shoestring, had at some point put her pen down and looked at him and said, "Why are you telling me all this? CEOs don't usually talk like this at these things." "I'm not really a CEO anymore," he said. "You're Damien Sterling," she said. "I read about you." "Then you know it's been a complicated few months." She considered him. "Is that why you're being honest? Because you lost things?" He thought about that for a moment. "I'm being honest because I spent a long time not being honest, and I got very tired of what that cost me. The losing things is..." He paused. "The losing things is related, but it's not the cause. You can lose things and still not get honest. Plenty of people do." Priya had looked at him with the specific evaluative attention of a young person deciding whether a senior person is worth taking seriously, and then she had picked up her pen again and said, "Okay, keep going." After that first conversation, he had agreed to meet with her monthly. Then 2 other founders had found him through mutual contacts. Then the organizer of the entrepreneurship event had asked if he would be willing to serve as a mentor in their formal program, and he had said yes. And now he met with 6 early-stage founders on a rotating schedule, once a month each, in a conference room he rented by the hour in a co-working space in Soma. He was not doing it as a reputation rehabilitation exercise. He had examined that possibility honestly and concluded it wasn't the primary motivation. He was doing it because it was unexpectedly the most useful he had felt in years, because the knowledge he had was actually valuable in this context, not the curated success story version, but the unvarnished version, the one that included the specific ways that confidence becomes blindness and momentum becomes an excuse not to look at what you're standing on. Priya told him once in their 4th session, "You're a better mentor than you probably were a CEO." He laughed, a real laugh, not a performed one. "You're probably right. Is that..." She tilted her head. "Does that bother you?" "6 months ago it would have," he said. "Right now, no." He considered it. "Right now, it mostly just seems like useful information." His mother came to visit in March. Eleanor Sterling was not the type to make a fuss about travel at 71, and she arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a small suitcase and the brisk efficiency of a woman who had always moved through the world on her own terms. She walked through his apartment with the careful attention she gave to environments, not judging exactly, assessing, and stopped at the terrace and looked out at the city. "It's small," she said. "I know." "I like it," she said. "It looks like you actually live here." He made dinner, nothing elaborate, pasta, something he had learned to cook adequately in the months since the Marine House. They ate at the small table, and she told him about Chicago and her garden and the neighbor's dog she had developed an antagonistic relationship with. And he listened and asked questions and didn't think about Sterltech or the acquisition or the board or any of the structures that had occupied the center of his attention for months. After dinner, she looked at him across the table and said, "You're different." "I know." "I don't mean worse, I mean different." She held her coffee cup in both hands. "You were always a very certain person, even as a boy. You would decide something and that was the end of it. You never entertained the possibility you might be wrong." "I know," he said. "It wasn't entirely a bad quality," she said. "It got you a long way, but..." She paused. "It made you very alone in a particular way, even when you were surrounded by people." He looked at his mother, this woman who had known him longer than anyone alive, who had watched him build and wreck and build again, and now sat across from him in his small apartment on a Tuesday night, talking to him the way you talk to someone you're not afraid of losing. "I was alone," he said. "I didn't know it." "No," she agreed. "You wouldn't have." "Did Vivian..."
He stopped, started again. When you met her, did you know what she was? His mother was quiet for a moment. I knew she was more than you were seeing, she said carefully. I didn't know the specifics, but I could tell that you weren't really asking what there was to see. She set her cup down. I should have said something. I wouldn't have heard it. Probably not. She looked at him. But I should have said it anyway. They sat in the quiet of that for a while. The city outside made its ambient sounds, traffic and wind, and the distant background texture of a place where many people lived their separate lives. And Damien sat across from his mother and felt, in the specific ordinariness of this evening, something he had not felt in a long time. Not happy exactly. His situation was too complicated for happiness to be the right word. But grounded. Present. In the room he was actually in. She built something remarkable, he said. Vivian, the Meridian platform, it's going to be significant. I watched the coverage and I can see what it is. His mother nodded. I'm glad, he said. And then, after a pause, I mean that. I'm genuinely glad. Eleanor Sterling looked at her son for a long moment. She did not say everything she thought because she was a woman who had learned over 7 decades that not everything thought needs to be said. But she nodded once, slowly, in a way that told him she believed him. Which was, he had come to understand, the only thing worth being believed for. Not your accomplishments, not your plans, not the story you constructed about yourself and offered to the world. The simple, ordinary, unimpressive truth. He was still learning that. He expected he would be learning it for a long time. Outside, the city moved through its evening. Somewhere in it, he didn't know where she was staying, whether she was in San Francisco or abroad, or somewhere else entirely. Vivian Cross Ashford was building something that would outlast whatever he had ever constructed, in the quiet and certain way she had always done everything. And Damien Sterling sat in his small apartment having dinner with his mother and thought, this too is real. This too counts. Even the small things, especially the small things. He refilled his mother's coffee, and she thanked him, and they talked until 10 o'clock about nothing consequential at all. Spring came to San Francisco the way it always did. Not with any dramatic announcement, but gradually, the light shifting by degrees until one morning you looked out the window and realized the quality of the air had changed while you weren't paying attention. Damien noticed it on a Tuesday in April, standing on his apartment terrace with coffee that had gone slightly cold while he was reading. The city below was doing its ordinary morning things, traffic building on the bridge, a container ship moving slowly through the bay, the fog thinning at the edges where the sun was winning its daily argument with the coast. He had lived in San Francisco for 19 years and had spent most of them looking at this city as a backdrop to his ambitions, the stage setting for the story he was telling about himself. He had not often looked at it simply as a real place, with its own indifferent beauty that had nothing to do with him. He was learning to do that. It was taking longer than he expected. The mentorship program had expanded without him particularly trying to expand it. Word moved through early-stage founder circles with the specific efficiency of communities that run on shared information. And by April, he was meeting with 11 founders on a rotating schedule, which required him to rent the co-working conference room 3 days a week instead of 1. The organizer of the entrepreneurship program, a compact, organized man named James Okafor, who had been running the initiative for 6 years and who had the particular gift of connecting people who needed each other without making a production of it, had asked Damien in March if he would consider formalizing his involvement. What does formalizing look like? Damien asked. A title if you want one, more structure, curriculum. James had a way of describing things that made them sound both modest and worth doing. Right now you're doing it informally, and people are finding value. With more structure, you could reach more people. Damien had thought about it for a week. He thought about the difference between doing something because it was useful and doing something because it gave you a role, and whether formalizing the thing would change which of those he was operating from. He decided he was probably overthinking it. Okay, he told James, but I don't want a title that makes it sound like I'm the expert. I'm not the expert. I'm the cautionary tale with some useful angles. James had smiled. I think you're underselling yourself. I spent 20 years overselling myself, Damien said. I'm trying the other direction for a while. He became a senior mentor in the program without fanfare. His sessions moved from the rented conference room to a dedicated space in the program's offices in the Mission,
a neighborhood he had driven through for years without ever really being in. The space was not impressive. Slightly worn furniture, a whiteboard that hadn't been fully erased, a window that looked out at the street where ordinary things happened at ordinary volume. He liked it. He had begun to like a lot of things he would have considered insufficiently significant a year ago. Priya's company raised its Series A in April. She called him the morning the round closed, not to give him credit, which he respected, but to tell him because they had developed the kind of connection where she thought he'd want to know. He was sitting in his car outside a coffee shop when the call came in, and he sat there for 20 minutes after it ended, not going anywhere. She had been the first. That was what he was sitting with. Not the first person he'd mentored. He'd managed and developed people throughout his career, but the first person he had been genuinely useful to in this particular way, this stripped-down way, without the scaffolding of his title or his company's resources or the performance of having everything figured out. He had sat across from Priya Mehta in a co-working conference room and told her the truth about his failures and watched her use that truth to build something better than she might have built without it. There was a satisfaction in that which he didn't have a pre-existing category for. It wasn't the satisfaction of closing an acquisition or hitting a revenue target or receiving a standing ovation at a summit. It was quieter than any of those things, and it sat differently in him, lower, more stable, less likely to require maintenance. He went into the coffee shop and ordered, and the person behind the counter didn't know who he was, and he sat at a small table by the window and drank his coffee and watched the street and felt, carefully and without overstating it to himself, like a man who was building something real. The message to Vivian took him 3 months to write. That is not a figure of speech. He began a first draft in January, the week after his mother's visit, when the clarity of that Tuesday dinner was still sharp enough to write from, and he opened it on his laptop and sat there for 40 minutes, and then closed it without writing anything. He opened it again in February and wrote 2 paragraphs and read them back and deleted them because they were too much about his situation. He was explaining the acquisition, explaining the board vote, explaining the rebuild. He was explaining himself in the way that people explain themselves when they want absolution, and Vivian Cross Ashford was not a confessional, and he was not looking for absolution. Or he was, but that was not her job, and making it her job would be doing the same thing he had always done, which was treating her as a function of his own narrative rather than a person with her own. He started again in March, and wrote a paragraph and stopped because it was too focused on what she had built. He was praising the Meridian platform and its market reception and her leadership, and all of those things were true and sincerely meant, but leading with them felt like another performance, like he was writing to the version of her that had become publicly significant rather than the person he had actually failed. He understood, working through these drafts, that what he was struggling to do was write to Vivian herself, not the heir to the Ashford Consortium, not the woman who had quietly enabled portions of his success, not the brilliant executive whose summit presentation had changed the temperature of an industry in 45 minutes, the woman who had stood in a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon saying this one, who had sat across from him at dinner for 11 years with real things behind her eyes that he had never asked about. That was the person he owed the letter to. He wrote the final version on a Thursday in April, 3 weeks after Priya's Series A. He wrote it by hand first, which he hadn't done since college, and which slowed him down in a way that turned out to be necessary, and then typed it into an email. It was not long, 4 paragraphs. He read it 4 times and changed 3 words, and then stopped changing things because he recognized he was hiding in revision. He sent it at 8:17 in the morning. The email said, in its compressed and inadequate way, this: that he was not writing to explain himself or seek something from her, that he had spent a great deal of time over the past several months understanding what he had not understood about their marriage, and that the understanding had not made him feel better so much as it had made him feel true, which was different, and he thought she would know the difference, that he had not valued her in the ways she deserved to be valued, not because she had been invisible to him, but because he had chosen not to look, which was worse, that he did not expect anything from this message. He was sending it because she deserved to receive it, and because carrying it unsent was beginning to feel like one more thing he was keeping for himself when it belonged to her. He closed by telling her that he was glad she was building what she was building, that he meant this without qualification, and that he hoped she was well, not as a formality, but genuinely. He pressed send and closed the laptop and went for a walk,
which had become something he did in moments that required time to settle. He walked for an hour through the neighborhood without his phone, which the pre-collapse version of himself would have found inconceivable, and he looked at the ordinary details of the ordinary streets and thought about nothing in particular, and let the morning be what it was. Image. Vivian's reply came 4 days later. He saw the notification on his phone on a Monday morning and sat down before he opened it. Not because he expected it to be devastating, but because he understood that whatever it said was going to land in a place that was still tender, and he wanted to be sitting. It was shorter than his message. 6 sentences. He read it twice and then put the phone down on the table and looked at the wall for a while. She wrote that she had received his message and had read it more than once. She said she believed he meant what he had written and that she had learned over a long year of significant changes to trust her own reading of things. She said that the marriage had been real to her, that she wanted him to know that, because she suspected he had wondered, and wondering about it was its own kind of weight she didn't want him to carry unnecessarily. She said she didn't have anger for him, which had surprised her when she discovered it. She had expected anger and found instead something more like grief, already partly resolved, for a version of things that hadn't become what it could have. She wished him well in what he was building. She had heard about the mentorship work, though she didn't say from whom, and she ended by writing, "You were always more than what you showed. I'm glad you're finding that out." That was all. He read it a 3rd time and a 4th time and then set the phone down carefully, as though it were fragile, which it wasn't. She had given him more than he had the right to ask for. She had told him the marriage was real. She had told him she carried no active anger. She had not given him an opening, had not suggested any future contact, had not offered the door she had no reason to leave open. She had simply confirmed what needed to be confirmed and then stood at a respectful distance, the way she had always known how to stand, present, complete, taking up exactly the space that was hers and no one else's. He put the phone in his pocket and went to his first mentorship session of the week shot. Priya had graduated, in a sense, from their monthly sessions. Her Series A meant she now had advisors and board members and the specific resources that money provides. And she didn't need Damien the way she had in the early days. She still called occasionally, and he was always available, but the formal sessions had given way to a more occasional contact that felt, to him, like the right outcome. You were supposed to make yourself unnecessary. That was the whole point. Her replacement in his regular rotation was a 28-year-old named Calvin Osei, who was building a healthcare data platform and who had the specific combination of technical brilliance and interpersonal blind spots that Damien recognized with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. Calvin reminded him of himself. Not in the surface details, but Calvin was quieter, more introverted, operating in a different sector, but in the underlying architecture of how he moved through his work and his relationships. He was someone who had decided early and not quite consciously that his intelligence was the most important thing about him, and who had organized his world to confirm that decision. Damien had been careful not to say this to Calvin directly. You could not hand someone an insight like that. They would reject it because insight delivered externally is still external, and what needed to happen was internal. What he did instead was ask questions. He had gotten very good at asking questions. In their 3rd session, Calvin had been describing a conflict with his co-founder, a woman named Iris, who handled the business side of the platform while Calvin ran the technology. The conflict was about roadmap prioritization, but as Damien listened to Calvin describe it, he could hear the actual thing beneath the surface, which was that Calvin had stopped consulting Iris before making decisions and had started presenting her with conclusions. "Tell me about the last time Iris surprised you," Damien said. Calvin blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, told you something about your business that you didn't already know, that you hadn't thought of. Something where you sat back and thought, I wouldn't have seen that." Calvin was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone accessing a memory they hadn't expected to access in this context. 6 months ago, he said, we were about to pursue a hospital system contract, big one. I had done all the technical analysis and the build timeline, and I was ready to commit. Iris sat down with me and showed me a reimbursement cycle problem on their end that would have made our payment timeline impossible. I hadn't looked at it. She had. He paused. If we'd signed that contract without her analysis, we'd have been in serious trouble. And since then? Damien asked. Calvin was quiet again, longer this time.
I've been less. He stopped. I've been going faster. I've been thinking I understand the landscape well enough now that I can move without. He stopped again. Damien didn't fill the silence. That was something else he had learned. Silence, held correctly, did its own work. I've been an idiot, Calvin said. You've been busy, Damien said. Busy and confident, which is a combination that makes people stop looking at what's next to them. He looked at Calvin. The question is whether you catch it at month 9 or year 9. Calvin looked at him. Mom, which did you catch it at? Year 11, Damien said. No, don't do year 11. Calvin nodded slowly, the specific nod of someone absorbing something that had weight. Then he said, What did you do about it when you finally caught it? Damien thought about that for a moment, about what he had done versus what he wished he had done. About the months of reconstruction, the company, the self, the slow and unglamorous work of becoming someone who could see clearly rather than someone who needed to be seen a certain way. I got honest, he said, with myself first. That's the only order it works in. He paused. And I stopped treating honesty as something to perform and started treating it as something to actually practice, every day, which is harder because nobody gives you credit for it. Does it work? Calvin asked. Damien thought about the email on his phone, about his mother at the small table drinking coffee, about Priya's Series A and the unglamorous conference room and the city he was finally actually looking at. It doesn't fix everything, he said, but it's the only direction I've found where things actually get better, rather than just looking better. He paused. That's the distinction. Looking better is fast and it lasts about 6 months. Getting better is slow and it compounds. Calvin wrote something in his notebook. Damien didn't ask what. James Okafor invited him to speak at the program's annual founder gathering in May, a dinner event for current mentees and alumni, held in a large open space in the Mission that had good light and exposed brick and the specific energy of rooms full of people who were still in the process of becoming. Damien almost declined. His instinct, when invited to speak, was still the old instinct, to assess the audience, identify the message that would land, construct the version of himself that would be most useful in the room. He caught himself doing it and recognized it as a habit that was not entirely dead, just quieter. He went. He did not prepare remarks in the traditional sense. He didn't write anything down, didn't plan a structure. He just went and sat in the room for the dinner portion and talked to people and listened, actually listened. And when James introduced him and he stood up, he said what was true. He talked about Sterile Tech. Not the version he had talked about at 100 events, not the founding story and the growth trajectory and the lessons of scaling. He talked about what had happened, about the specific pride that had made him unable to see what was next to him, about what it had cost professionally and personally, and about what he had learned from the costing that he could not have learned any other way. He talked about Vivian without using her name, describing her as someone who had been in his life for a long time and whom he had fundamentally failed to see, and about how discovering this had not been a dramatic moment, but an accumulating series of smaller understandings, each one a little more uncomfortable than the last, like eyes adjusting to a light that had always been there. The room was very quiet while he spoke. He talked about the difference between building a reputation and building a character, about how reputation was external and responsive and could be managed, and how character was the thing that existed when no one was watching and no stakes were visible. He had spent 20 years on his reputation. He was, for the first time, working seriously on his character. He did not recommend the order in which he had done those two things. He said, "The most important relationships in your life will not be the ones with the loudest people. They will be the quiet ones, the ones who don't demand to be noticed, but who, by their presence, make everything around them function better. Learn to see those people. Ask them questions. Take their answers seriously. Don't wait until their absence teaches you what their presence was worth." He was not sure he said any of it with the eloquence it deserved. He was not much interested in eloquence anymore. He was interested in being understood. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. Not a roaring applause. Not the standing ovation of the summit. Just genuine, solid appreciation. The kind that comes from people who have heard something they needed to hear and know it. James put a hand on his shoulder afterward and said, "That's the best thing I've heard in this room in 6 years. Damien said, "I had a lot of material." Summer came. The city brightened in the way it brightened when the fog finally lost its grip and the days went long and golden, and the bay turned colors in the afternoons that had no precise name. The Meridian platform launched its first enterprise-scale deployment in June, with Dynacorp as the anchor client, the same Dynacorp that Gerald Marsh had mentioned in that Dallas conference room, the one that had been approached with knowledge of Sterltech's pain points. Damien read the press release on a Tuesday morning with coffee that was the right temperature for once, and he was surprised to find, genuinely pleased. He was pleased in a way that was clean, not complicated by bitterness or loss or any of the thorny feelings he might have expected. Vivian had built something that worked. The technology he had helped build was now part of a larger and better resourced whole. People were using both of those things to do real work. That was the actual outcome, stripped of everything else, and the actual outcome was fine. Better than fine. He had been living in that apartment for 8 months by then, and the walls were still mostly bare except for 2 things he had put up in the spring. A photograph his mother had sent him from Chicago of the 2 of them at a family event years ago, when he was in his 20s and she was in her 50s, and they were both laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. And a single piece of paper, not framed, just taped to the wall beside his desk, on which he had written, in his own handwriting, the sentence from Vivian's email that he kept coming back to. "You were always more than what you showed. I'm glad you're finding that out." He looked at it some mornings when he sat down at the desk, not as a wound and not as a consolation, more as a compass, a reminder of where he was trying to go and what the direction required. In July, he received a call from a venture capital firm asking if he would be willing to serve in an advisory capacity for a portfolio company going through an operational restructuring. It was essentially asking him to do professionally what he had been doing informally with the mentorship program. Bring his experience of building and failing and rebuilding to a company that needed to learn something he had already learned the hard way. He took the call and listened carefully. The firm was reputable. The portfolio company was a real business with real problems and real people working on them. The engagement would be part-time and specific, not a title, not a seat, just a role with defined scope and honest purpose. He said yes. It was not, by any measure he had previously used, a significant professional engagement. It was not the kind of thing that appeared in a Forbes profile or got you invited to speak at the GTC Summit. It was just useful work, carefully scoped, offered by people who wanted his genuine judgment rather than his name above the door. He had spent 20 years thinking those 2 things were the same. He understood now that they were almost entirely different, and that almost everything valuable he had done in the past year had come from operating in the gap between them. He ran into a former colleague at a coffee shop in September, a man named Daniel Park, who had been a senior VP at Sterltech 4 years ago, and who had left to join another firm, and who looked, when Damien appeared in his peripheral vision, briefly startled before settling into warmth. They sat for 20 minutes. Daniel asked how he was, and Damien told him honestly, which was something he had gotten better at in proportion to how much less frightening honesty had become. Daniel told him about his current company and some frustrations with his current CEO and asked, at one point, in the careful way people ask things when they're actually asking something else, "Do you miss it, the day-to-day, running things?" Damien thought about it genuinely. "I miss some of it," he said. "I miss the problem solving, the specific satisfaction of taking something that doesn't work and making it work. I was good at that." "You were excellent at that," Daniel said. "I miss the people. Some of them." He thought about Sandra Kwan, who was now COO of the restructured Sterltech entity under Ashford's technology division, and was, by every account he could find, doing it excellently. He had sent her a brief message when the appointment was announced. She had replied with 3 words, "Thank you." Finally. He had laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "I don't miss the version of myself that was running things," he said. "That version wasn't—" He searched for the word. He wasn't paying attention to the right things. Daniel nodded slowly. "What are the right things?" It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Daniel Park was 51 years old and had spent his career in technology and was sitting across from Damien Sterling in a coffee shop on a Wednesday, asking him what the right things were. And Damien took the question seriously enough to sit with it for a moment before answering. "The people right next to you," he said finally. "Not the stakeholders, not the market, the actual people, The ones in the room with you who are doing something alongside you for whatever reason they're doing it. He looked at his coffee. I spent 20 years treating the people around me as instruments of a goal rather than as, he paused, as the point. He looked at Daniel. The goal is supposed to serve the people. I had it backward. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You should write some of this down." "I have people I tell it to," Damien said. "More people should hear it." He thought about that on the walk home. He was not going to write a book. He was too aware of the vanity that lived in the impulse to write a book about your own reckoning, the way it could become another form of performance even when it started as something genuine. But he thought about his sessions with Calvin, with Priya, with the 7 other founders he met with regularly, and about the simple possibility that what he had learned told plainly and without architecture might be worth continuing to offer. He had been given, by circumstances he had not chosen and would not have chosen, a specific and costly education. The education was his. What he did with it was also his. And the thing he was finding, slowly and without fanfare, was that the doing with it, the actual sitting down with people and telling the truth about what he had seen and where it had taken him, was the most substantive thing he had done with his life since the early days of Stirltech, when the work itself had been new enough to require all of him. No. On the last day of September, Damien Sterling sat on his terrace in the late afternoon with a book he had not been reading and looked at the bay. The light was doing something specific. The particular late afternoon thing it did in the fall, lower and more amber, making the water look like something you'd want to paint if you painted, which he didn't. A container ship moved toward the Golden Gate with the unhurried certainty of something that knew where it was going. Somewhere across that water, Vivian Cross Ashford was building her global legacy in the quiet and certain way she had always done things, and Damien was here on this small terrace with a book and a view and a life that no longer looked the way he had designed it to look. He thought, it's better this way, not easier. Better is not the same as easier, and he had learned that distinction with his whole body over the past year, but truer, more actual, the kind of life that, when he sat in it at the end of a day, felt like it was actually being lived by him rather than executed on his behalf by a version of himself who knew how things were supposed to look. He thought about the morning a year ago when he had woken up feeling lighter than he had in years, how he had read that lightness as freedom. He understood now that what it had actually been was loss, the specific weightlessness of a man who has put down something precious without knowing its weight. You only felt how heavy it was after it was gone, when your arms weren't tired anymore and the absence of the effort made you realize what you had been holding. He had been holding Vivian's patience for 11 years, and he had called it a weight and put it down on a mahogany desk in a manila envelope and called that freedom. He had been wrong. He had been so specifically, instructively, irreversibly wrong. And here was the thing he had been learning to hold alongside that wrongness, the thing that took longer than any other understanding to arrive, because it required him to stop punishing himself long enough to see clearly. Being wrong was not the end of the story. It was not even necessarily the worst thing in it. The worst thing would have been staying wrong. The worst thing would have been defending the wrongness the way he had once defended everything, with the full force of his confidence and his certainty and his very particular inability to ask what was right next to him. He had not done that. Slowly, messily, expensively, he had turned toward the truth instead. And the truth was uncomfortable and had cost him his company and his marriage and his specific self-image and a relationship and a house and a portion of a decade. All of that was true. Also true, he was sitting on a terrace in the late afternoon looking at a bay that was genuinely beautiful, with the clearest conscience he had possessed in 15 years, and the morning's mentorship session with Calvin had produced a moment of real understanding, and Priya had sent him a photograph of her team at their new office with the caption, "Look what we did." And his mother had called that morning for no particular reason, and he had answered. These were small things. He was learning that small things were not a lesser category of experience. They were, in fact, the category that everything else was made from. And the people who understood that were, in his direct observation, significantly less likely to arrive at 43 with their hands empty of the things that actually mattered. He thought about what he would say to himself at 30, the man he had been, so sure and so fast and so thoroughly convinced that the direction he was moving was the only direction worth moving. He would say, slow down, look at who's next to you, ask them who they are,
Not because it's strategic, not because the relationship is an asset, because they are there and they are real, and you are going to need what they carry long before you know you need it. He would say, the quietest people in your life are not the least significant people. They are, almost always, the opposite. He would say, be careful. The person you underestimate may be the one holding up your entire world. He recognized the words as he thought them. He let them sit. The container ship had cleared the bridge. The light on the water had shifted to something deeper and less amber, the specific color of an October evening coming on, and the city was warming up its nighttime sounds. The accumulating texture of millions of people moving through their evenings, each of them in the middle of something, carrying things he would never know about, doing the complicated and imperfect work of being alive. He picked up his book. He actually read it this time. And the city did what cities do. It continued, indifferent and alive, the same and different from moment to moment, carrying everyone in it toward whatever was going to happen next, whether they were ready or not, whether they deserved it or not, whether they had learned what they needed to learn or were still, in whatever time remained, in the process of finding out. Damian Sterling was in the process of finding out. He thought that was probably the right place to be.